replaced Strom Thurmond, the long-standing senator from South Carolina, who had started his career as a Democrat. In fact, he had competed against Harry Truman for the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1948. Senator Graham is his successor as a Republican. Well, actually, Strom Thurmond had also shifted to the Republican Party, but Senator Graham was Strom Thurmond's replacement. So he is among that first generation of Southern elected officials elected as Republicans. Not that there were some that shifted from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, but he was elected as a Republican, and was part of that generation that developed an almost solid Republican South. We've seen changes in Georgia and Virginia since, but Graham comes in this period, and his philosophy is that of a conservative. In the George W. Bush period, given his views on American power and the use of that power overseas, he was considered a neoconservative. I think that if one had asked him a week ago, he would continue to describe himself as a conservative. I don't know how his conservatism in his own mind was reconciled to the kinds of principles and practices that conservatives now defend as part of the MAGA movement. But I think he would consider himself a Southern conservative of a tradition that was originally in the Democratic Party, but by the time he was of age as a politician, was firmly at the center of the Republican Party in the South.
You mentioned his steadfast support for Ukraine, and he had just traveled to Ukraine, had just met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He just celebrated his 71st birthday a matter of days ago. You talked about his support for NATO, but also I'd like to get into his very close relationship with Israel, and that's been one of the first nations with a flood of reaction, real heartbreak from Israeli politicians who are calling him one of the greatest friends of Israel, who stood with Israel in its darkest hours. This is an ex-post I'm just going to read from the former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, saying, quote, "I'm heartbroken to hear of the passing of my friend, Senator Lindsey Graham." What made his relationship with Israel so special and unique and so valued by his friends in Israel, particularly at this time where they're trying to get continued support for the conflict with Iran?
Well, I think first of all, it's the leadership positions that he held over time in the Republican caucus and in the Senate, coupled with the fact that he held to foreign policy views associated with the neoconservative movement. Israel was viewed as a staunch ally in the Middle East, as the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel, though not a part of NATO, was considered as close to the United States by neoconservatives as NATO allies in the defense of liberty around the world. And Lindsey Graham's views in that instance, in that case, his views didn't change. So he comes from a tradition. It goes back to Ronald Reagan, although he wasn't serving in Congress in the Reagan years, but it is a tradition that goes back to Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party, especially, and it's involved a fervent support for Israel as a perceived bastion of democracy in the Middle East, and as Israel chose a extraordinarily controversial form of counterinsurgency after October 7th, Lindsey Graham stayed close to Israel and continued to defend Israel. In a sense, although former President Biden's became incrementally more critical of the Netanyahu government's approach after October 7th. President Biden's initial reaction to the attack on Israel by Hamas was in many ways symbolic of that firm senatorial, largely bipartisan support for Israel that Senator Graham personified, as well as